Switching a little bit to an important topic for this crowd, Senator. I'm the son of Mexican grandparents who immigrated, and they found Christ here in this nation. For Hispanics, you don't separate the United States from God.
Sure.
And the left has waged war on those values. We see coaches getting put into jail for praying on the field. We see anti-Semitism running rampant on college campuses.
Yep.
We know at BNB.CPAC that when the church votes, we win every single time.
That's right.
You have a very special story of how you came to God. Can you share a little bit about that, and
Sure.
how are we going to bring God back into healing this nation?
Yeah, well, we have, tens of millions of Christians who go to church every single Sunday won't show up to vote in 2024. And to my fellow Christians, I'd say, if you don't show up and vote, that's how we lose this country. This is not just disagreements about tax policy. I mean, these guys are explicitly going after fundamental religious liberties, the right for you to raise your kids in the church that you want to, the right for nuns to practice their faith as they want to and minister as they want to. That's all on the table. And, you're right. I do have an interesting faith journey, though I think it's probably pretty similar to a lot of folks' faith journey, which is I was raised by a grandmother. And my grandmother raised me because my own mom struggled with addiction for a big chunk of my early life. And Mamaw was a woman of many contrasts. I mean, I think it's important to be honest that she was a very devout Christian. She was a very thoughtful Christian. I mean, she read the Bible every day. She thought about what it required of her, even though she hadn't graduated from high school herself. She also really loved the F word. I mean, she was a foul-mouthed woman, even though she was a very devout Christian. And Usha will tell you that sometimes I talk like Mamaw does, and the 4-year-old repeats it, and that's a problem. But, I think like a lot of young people, I went to high school, and then I went to the Marine Corps, and then I went to college after the Marine Corps. I started to think that I knew more than my grandmother did. And I started to feel like this sort of young man's arrogance about the problems that were out there, the questions that I had my own answers to. And by the time I was probably 24, 23, I sort of just said, I don't believe in this stuff anymore. And I kind of discarded my faith. And, what brought me back to Christ was actually falling in love with Usha because, the more that I sort of thought, okay, I'm madly in love with this woman. I want to marry her. I want to be a father. I want to sort of do all those things. When you start thinking about the really deep questions, not about like what education do you have or what kind of job do you have, but how do I be a good husband? How do I be a good father? Like what is required of me in those important vocations? What I kept coming back to is Mamaw's Christian faith had a lot more wisdom than whatever it was that I had adopted since abandoning my Christian faith. And the big questions, how to be a virtuous person, how to be a good husband and father, I thought the Christian faith had the best answers to those questions, and that got me back on the pathway. I was actually baptized for the first time in 2019 because I'd never been baptized as a kid, and here I am.
That is an incredible story. You were talking about Tim Walz and that debate. He mentioned he was a knucklehead at one point, but we won't get into that. But during his time and his time now as Minnesota governor, talking about parental rights, something that is incredibly important for the Latino community as well, where they did pass a law that would allow, they could take the child away from the parents if the parents don't agree
this is really scary
in this
stuff.
transitioning of gender. Walk us through why we should be very concerned about a Harris-Walz administration and what that would mean.
Well, I think, and luckily most of our citizens, even people who might disagree with us politically, are not there yet. But Kamala Harris and Tim Walz have really bought into the furthest left-wing social doctrine of the modern Democratic Party. And so take, for example, a kid, and I think we all know being a teenager is confusing, especially in the era of social media. I think a lot of us say that these kids who are gender confused, they need support, they need love, they don't need chemical interventions that are irreversible when they're 13 years old. Now, I would call what I just said common sense, and frankly, I think 80%, 90% of our fellow citizens would agree with it. But if you disagree, and you think the solution is a permanent chemical intervention in that child's body, then you have to ask yourself, who makes those decisions, the parents or the government? And unfortunately, Tim Walz's leadership in Minnesota, and Kamala Harris, this has happened in California too, they've endorsed the idea of taking children away from their parents if the parents don't consent to gender transition. And I think, you start talking about somebody's going to take my kid away because I don't want them experimenting on their bodies in a chemical way, that is preposterous and a violation of the most important right I think that we have anywhere in our society. That's the right of parents to parent their children how they see fit. It's disgraceful, and it's scary. It really is. And I think we have to ask ourselves, because as Christians, of course, sometimes our values aren't always popular, especially with modern secular culture. We have to ask ourselves, do we want the right to parent our children as we see fit, or do we want the state to have the right to take them away from us if we dare to teach our children what we believe? And I think, unfortunately, even though Kamala Harris wouldn't say it like that, that's on the ballot. So if you want to parent your children as you see fit, Donald Trump is the only candidate on the ballot who's going to fight for that right and fight for it for a very long time.